Questions of Doom. Hello, and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, or indeed, as you'll see at the end of this video. It's my fond hope that in answering these questions by video, the answers are not only useful to the person who has asked the question, but also to those of you out there who may be thinking or wondering the same thing. So, today's question comes from Mr. Charles W. I believe this is his second question, so yes, very curious mind is Charles. And it goes something like this. I have just been watching History Cold Case on the BBC, and they were investigating some skeletons found at the bottom of a cave. The bones were broken since the drop was over 30 feet, and yet they immediately began speculating on whether or not they had been broken as part of a rite involving human sacrifice. Why even speculate about such a situation? Is it that the public have a morbid fascination, and that it's seen as an effective way to spice up the subject of archaeology? Or is there actually genuine archaeological evidence that these practices were widespread in the ancient world? Best regards, Charles. Well, Charles, I think you're right. There is a certain amount of morbid fascination with these practices, and there's often a tendency to assume that they were very widespread. As for evidence, well, again, often this comes down to interpretation. So I suppose there are several things that are worthwhile exploring in this question. So I suppose first of all, the BBC, or media reporting of archaeological finds, they love a good story, and nothing is more dramatic than human sacrifice. And if someone on the site or nearby will tell them a good story, the BBC will run with that. Now, another excellent example actually of this was at Cheddar Gorge earlier this year, and the BBC were reporting on essentially just the caves. I think that they'd found some more artwork, and also they were looking at the bones and whether or not the bones had essentially been defleshed as a cannibalistic rite, or whether it was some sort of ritual defleshing, some sort of releasing of the soul, that kind of business. And they came to the conclusion that it had been cannibalism. Now, the person that they had talking to the BBC reporter was a volunteer on the site, who wasn't necessarily the archaeologist who did the excavation, or indeed an archaeologist who was trained in interpreting bones. But the volunteer obviously loves a good story and loves to bring people in and tell them the story. So he was telling them that what this evidence means, what this evidence shows, is that if you were around in this part of the world at the height of the last ice age and you weren't eating people, then you were clearly very strange. Now that's a big leap, isn't it? To go from, well, here's an instance of potential cannibalism in an extreme environment when it's extraordinarily cold, to saying that it's normal to take a bite out of your neighbour, and if you weren't eating your neighbours, then you were weird. And yet that story was publicised to the whole of Britain on breakfast TV. People saw it with their breakfast on the way out to school and on the way out to work, and the seed has been planted. People in the past were cannibals, and it was very, very casual cannibalism. So I suppose in that sense, there's certainly a sense of responsibility which is sometimes lacking in the way that these stories are reported. I definitely agree with you on that, and it's incredibly frustrating that never let the truth get in the way of a good story, as they say. And I think in this case, it's definitely true with archaeology, because people like to imagine that the past was full of barbaric cartoon characters in that sense. But then this actually leads into the next point, and that is whether or not these practices were widespread. Now, for example, we know things like, for example, when the Romans came to Britain, or indeed when the Romans went anywhere else other than Italy, they definitely liked to talk about the fact that apparently people were killing each other out there, they're sacrificing each other to their gods, and we need to stop this, because the Romans had outlawed human sacrifice around about the turn of the first millennium AD. However, Obviously they continued with gladiatorial games, so there's a distinction there for them in what human sacrifice was. But this, again, could be nothing more than a political ploy. When you look at, for example, bog bodies across Europe, there's no real evidence that these people are necessarily being sacrificed. There's no evidence that they're not either. It's more just a case of, well, these people are dead and they're killed in a ritualistic way. But it may be something else. It may be that, for example, it's some sort of organised regicide. Perhaps the crop doesn't grow properly, so everyone goes, well, we have to kill the leader, and the leader goes, okay, fair enough, and it's just part of their culture to do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a human sacrifice to a god in that respect. It could just be a political thing. It could be, you're out of your office now, so we'll kill you. But if only they could do that in Italy, eh? But in that respect, though, I think that the power, again, of the cartoon character is prevalent, and that's actually probably what mattered more to the orators who were explaining the need to bring civilization to these barbaric people. It was very easy to do that in the context of a cartoon character who was going around killing people, and or cultures that were going around condoning murder in that sense. But you also have to ask as well, what in that respect, what is a human sacrifice, and also whether or not the quality of life is preferred to the value of death, as it were. So, for example, there are people who say that that the so-called Mesoamerican ball game that was played in Mesoamerica, the winning team was the team whose captain would be sacrificed, and that they were playing for the honour to be sacrificed. And I think that's another aspect. Is yes, there's the cartoon character of people in the past killing each other, but there's also the aspect of our values. We value life an awful lot. And it may actually be that some people in the past genuinely valued death. They valued the honour of the correct death in that sense. So there's all sorts of things going on, and I think that the way that it's reported often puts our values onto the past and says, well, clearly they'd be terrified to do this, and it's horrendous what society's doing to this person. But who knows? The person at the bottom of the pit may actually have wanted to die. It may have been like that. I suppose in terms of whether or not these practices are widespread, I guess it all depends on whether or not we're able to actually detect the difference between a death, say a murder, and a human sacrifice. And it's one of those things where it's very open. It is very open to interpretation. One person's ritualised burial ground is another person's massacre. One person's accident is another person's murder, and you have to be very sure of your evidence, I suppose, before you actually label it as a human sacrifice. But unfortunately, people aren't always that careful. Another example comes to mind. There's the Talheim mass grave in Germany, where it looks like people around about with the arrival essentially of the Neolithic, some people were bound and shot at close range with arrows rather, not an arrow, and then dumped in a cave, and that could be labelled as human sacrifice, but it could also be labelled as an extreme punishment for civil disobedience, which okay, I mean we don't do it anymore, but certainly not that long ago we were doing it. Now, who's to say that hanging someone isn't an act of human sacrifice, or couldn't be interpreted as an act of human sacrifice? So I suppose it's also whether or not archaeologists are actually able to distinguish between, for example, an execution which is sanctioned by society, and a human sacrifice which is also sanctioned by society. Because let's face it, I mean, when you see when people were hung anyway in this country, there was an awful lot of ritual around that. Who's to say that's not a sacrifice? Yeah, so this is a very complicated question actually, and it's well worth thinking about. And I think all I can do really is ask questions as well, actually, and talk around the topic. And it'd be fascinating actually to hear from the rest of you guys watching. You should feel free to comment below on what you think about this topic. Personally, I don't think human sacrifice it was as prevalent in the past as people often make out. I think it makes a good story, and I think that that particularly when it comes to media news outlets, they often will seek out the most fantastical elements and put them forward because they're interesting. But at the same time, um, what they don't know is that some of the more mundane things are just as interesting, if not more interesting. So it's one of those things where I think not only, yes, they're seeking out these cartoon characters, but also I think archaeologists need to take more responsibility for what images are put out there. So explaining the drama of a ritual defleshing as opposed to cannibalism and what the difference is probably or would be just as interesting to people if it was actually explained. But I think often archaeologists don't do that. So so in terms of how it's reported, I'd certainly think that that archaeologists need to take more responsibility for not controlling, but I suppose, but for managing how things are put forward, because it's all right to excavate it, but if you then leave it rather to someone who's going to willfully misinterpret it to gain a quick buck, then you haven't done your job properly, have you? In terms of the prevalence of human sacrifice, again, that's probably all down to interpretation, but also down to, I dare say, the cultures that the people were living in, and whether or not sacrifice and death was seen as a bad thing or a good thing or a condoned thing. It's a very complicated question. But even though I don't feel as though I've actually properly answered this, I've just sort of talked around the topics. I definitely appreciate the opportunity, I suppose, to talk about around these issues, and I look forward to hearing what you guys out there think and feel. So, thank you very much, Charles W., for asking the question. I've certainly given you my opinion, but I guess that's all I can really do in this instance, because often these things are down to interpretation. And if you have any thoughts on this, please do comment below, guys, and let's give Charles a good debate to read, or a good discussion to follow through. So, until next time, thank you very much.